I want to get you tonight to turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. I think many, if not all of us, grew up hearing the story of David and Goliath. And it is probably a story which almost any third grade Bible student can recite to you and tell you the basic details of as they're relating how David conquered that Philistine giant. And yet in all of its familiarity, there are some aspects of that story that I think maybe we've missed. Some things about it, a little bit of background that might help us have a better understanding of some of the things that God would have us consider in our own lives, especially as we consider what God was doing. So tonight, what I want to do is spend some time leading up to 1 Samuel 17 and then also looking at what God says there in order that we might draw attention to this victory that God granted this young man over a giant, a young man by the name of David, who was the son of Jesse. Before we get into 1 Samuel 17, I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 12, God calls Abraham to leave where he's at and go to the land that God is going to show him. And in that chapter, God establishes, if you'll notice verse 3, there's something that God says to Abraham in the process of establishing His covenant with Abraham. What He says to Abraham is this. He says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." I want you to notice that middle phrase, "the one who curses you, I will curse." You may remember from the story of David and Goliath that Goliath does curse David and curses the God of the Israelites. And so if God is true to His promise, then the fact that Goliath curses the people of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham, then God is going to deal with this giant in His own way. But let's not stop there. Let's come forward just a little bit. And when you move forward several hundred years, you come to the time of Moses. He's leading the children of Israel. They've come out of Egypt, having witnessed God's miraculous work there among the Egyptians themselves with 10 different plagues that God brings upon them. They cross the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is destroyed. They come to Mount Sinai. They receive the law. And then they progress on toward the Promised Land. They camp at a place called Kadesh Barnea. And it is from here that Moses sends out 12 men to look over the land. We call them spies. They're to see what the land is like, what the cities are like, if they're well fortified, what the people are like in the land. And the 12 spies come back after 40 days, and they give their report. 10 of the spies give a very discouraging report. And one of the things that we note there in that report, especially if you want to look over there, is found in Numbers chapter 13. In verses 32 and 33, here is what the 12 spies, or the 10 of the 12 say. It says, "So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out. The land through which we went, or of which we have gone in spying out, is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight." What you immediately understand as you read this is that because of their fear of these giants that lived in the land that God was going to give them, they refused to go into the land of promise and to take possession of it as God had commanded them to do. So because of that, God causes them to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. At least, and all of those from the age of 20 and upward died in the wilderness, who were 20 and upward at the time that God placed that curse upon them. Until the second generation is camped on the outskirts of the land, this time in the plains of Moab, and Moses speaks to them yet again, and Moses says some things to them. First of all, Deuteronomy chapter 1, and then we'll look at Deuteronomy chapter 28. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, God says, "See, the Lord your God has placed the land before you. Go up and take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed." And then over in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 7, Moses says, "The Lord shall cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you one way and will flee before you 7 ways." There's a recurring theme. If you've picked up on it already, then you know where we're going with this. And the recurring theme is, listen, God is fighting for you. God is the one doing your battle. Your enemies are going to flee before you. Why? Because your enemies are God's enemies. And so you do not need to fear. You do not need to be afraid of anyone in the land of promise, no matter how large they might be, because God is going before you. Now we go to 1 Samuel. You remember the story of Hannah and that baby boy that God blessed her with, whom she named Samuel. And in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, she prays a prayer. And there are 2 places, 2 parts of that prayer I want you to notice. First of all, verses 3 and 4, and then we'll jump down just a little bit. Here's what she says in the prayer. "Boast no more so proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength." And then drop down to verse 9. "He keeps the feet of His godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them He will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and He will give strength to His king, and will exalt the horn of His anointed." Again, God is going to raise up the weak and the feeble, and He's going to tear down the mighty and those who appear to be strong. If you come forward yet again several years, Saul is now king. He's the first king, been anointed by Samuel. And he is confronted with the Philistines. 1 Samuel chapter 13. What we find is that the Israelite army is beginning to shrink because the people are becoming afraid as Saul is waiting upon Samuel to come and offer his offering, the burnt sacrifice, burnt offering, to seek God's blessing upon the people. And in the meantime, Saul's son Jonathan makes a decision to do something. Unbeknownst to his father, he attacks a Philistine outpost. And in the process of preparing to attack this Philistine outpost with no more than just his armor bearer by his side, he makes a statement that reflects his faith. There in chapter 14 of 1 Samuel, verse 6, he speaks these words. He says to the young man who's carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or few." You see, God isn't concerned about the number. He's concerned about the faith. He isn't concerned about the size. He's concerned about whether or not you trust in Him. And so when we come to the confrontation involving Goliath, in the light of everything that we've seen at this point, the question comes forth when you first begin reading the story is this: why are the Israelites afraid of Goliath? Why are they afraid of him? If they had thought about their history and the God that they serve, their question would have been, only one giant? Huh! We can take him on with our God. He's not a problem. Let's go. But that's not what we see. You see, the problem that you encounter in the Israelites' battle with the Philistines on this occasion, it's not the man in front of them. That's not the problem. The problem is their lack of faith. The problem is their lack of godly leadership. That's the problem. And so, it's their unbelief as God's people that prevent them from going ahead and doing battle with this army that is in front of them. So let's now move to chapter 17 of 1 Samuel and let's see what happens. You see, as we come into this, we find that there has been a partial defeat. If you go back to chapter 14, chapters 13 and 14, there's been a partial defeat initiated by Jonathan, as we saw just a moment ago, of the Philistines. And now the Philistines are looking for revenge. They're kind of humiliated, so they want to once again regain their power. So some 15 miles to the southwest of Jerusalem, the two armies have come up against each other. In between them is a valley. It's called the Valley of Elah. Had the privilege to go there several years ago, and there's a little brook that runs right in the middle of this valley. And you have mountains on both sides. They call them mountains. We would call them hills here in Tennessee, with ridges. And on one side is the Philistine army, and on the other side is the Israelite army. And what they're doing every day is they're coming out, face each other. But here's the interesting thing. They don't engage in battle. Every day they come out and face each other, and they give their war cries, but they do not engage each other in battle. Now the Philistines have far superior weapons. They've got chariots. We read back in chapter 13 that they had some 30,000 iron chariots. Here we know that they not only have chariots, but they also have bronze and iron in their weapons, which the Israelites do not have. They are far outranked as far as the quality of the weapons that the Philistines have as compared to the Israelites' weapons. But it's something else that may be weighing in on a part of it, and that is the territory. You see, the Philistines have chariots, but they don't do good on mountainsides or on hillsides. They need flat land to truly work well. So that may be part of the reason. But anyway, with all that going on, suddenly we're introduced to the Philistines' champion. His name is Goliath. And he comes out in the morning and in the evening every day as these two armies have stood facing each other to issue a challenge. Maybe he saw it as an opportunity. You know, we've been standing here facing each other, but we haven't engaged in battle yet. But he comes out and he offers a challenge, and the challenge is, bring out your best man. I will fight him. I will take him on. And if you win and you prevail, then we will serve you. If your champion kills me, then the Philistines will serve you. However, if I kill your champion, if I am victorious, then you will become our servants. Fair enough. But here's what we find in verse 11. And that is that when Saul and the rest of the army, all of Israel, heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed. They were greatly afraid. Why? Well, you looked at Goliath lately? Scripture tells us there in verse 4 that he was 6 cubits in a span. All right. How tall was that? That is 9 feet 6 inches tall. Last night we were down at the high school watching the ball game, and I was looking at the backboard on the goal, and I saw where you do know that the rim is 10 foot above the floor. Top of the rim. You look down from that, and if you look at the backboards down here at our high school, there's a little grayish blue line, and about to the top of that line is about 9 foot 6 inches. I thought, well, if you had that man on your team, you wouldn't have a problem at all. He can slam dunk standing on his feet. But he's that tall. Not only that, the armor that this man wears, bronze helmet, and then he has a coat of armor that weighs approximately 125 pounds. Put that on and walk around with it for a little bit and see what it does to you. He has bronze sheaths on his legs protecting him. He has a javelin that hangs between his shoulder blades. He has a spear that it says the handle is the size of a weaver's beam. And then the head of that spear of iron weighs some 15 pounds. And if that isn't enough, out in front of him is his armor bearer carrying his shield. Want to go up against that fella? You'd never get close to him because his reach alone could keep you at bay. You know, you imagine me 5 foot 10 inches tall or so, and then there's somebody that outranks me by 4 feet or almost. It's a little hard to do battle with someone like that in the weapons of that day. And so, yes, they were afraid of him. They cowered back from him because all they could see was this man and how large he was, and no one from Israel, including Saul himself, wanted to go up against him. But then we encounter someone else. Beginning in verse 12, we're introduced to a young man that we've already encountered because he's been anointed to be the next king of Israel. And if you notice something that is missing when you first began reading in verse 12 and read through verse 16, it's this. There is nothing given to us about this young man David's stature or about his strength or about any weapons he may possess. None of that is shared with us because he doesn't have any. No, he's simply referred to as the youngest son of Jesse the Ephraimite, who is from Bethlehem in Judah. And we're told that his father is very old. And we're told that his three oldest brothers have gone to war with Saul, and that they've left David at home because, by the way, he's the youngest of all of the sons, and he's there at home taking care of Dad and the sheep, except for the times when he's called away to go play music for Saul in order to calm Saul, because the Spirit of God has left him and fallen upon David. And that's what we saw back in chapter 16. So one day, what happens? Jesse sends David to go check on his brothers at battle or in battle. And David puts together some things to take, some roasted grain and 10 loaves of bread and 10 select cuts of cheese. The bread and the grain is for his brothers and probably may be shared with some of the others that they serve with. And then the cheese is for his commander or their commander of 1,000 to give to him. Early the next morning, he leaves the sheep with somebody to watch over them, and he heads out. He gets there just as they're going up to their battle line. And so he leaves the supplies that he's brought with the keeper or the baggage keeper, and he goes up to join his brothers in the battle line. And while he's standing there talking to them, Goliath comes out for the 81st time. You heard it right. 81 times this giant has been going out morning and evening and saying the same thing over and over and over again. 81 times. This is the 81st time. Because he's done it for 40 days up to this point, morning and evening. And now here comes the 41st day, and here he is doing it again. Makes his challenge, as he always did. The only thing different this time is somebody else is present that hasn't been there in the past. That's David. And as David listens, he overhears some of the men talking after Goliath finishes, and they talk about what King Saul has promised to give the man who will go out and fight this giant. And he can't believe his ears. He'll do what? He'll make that man wealthy. He'll give him his choice of Saul's daughters to marry. He'll make his father's family free of any taxation in the land of Israel. David can't believe that nobody has jumped on this, that nobody has responded, especially because of what this Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine is doing, which is blaspheming God. He asked around to confirm that what he's heard is true, and others say, yes, that's it. And they repeat the same thing. And he can't understand why nobody is accepting the king's offer. Well, his oldest brother Eliab overhears David and the things David's saying, and he becomes angry with David. He becomes so angry that he takes his anger out upon David, and he accuses David. First thing he does is accuses David of coming to the battlefield only to watch what's going on. He comes for the wrong reason. He also accuses him of forsaking his responsibilities back home, which was caring for his father's sheep. And the final thing he accuses him of is he judges his young brother's heart, basically, and says, your heart's wicked. Well, Eliab doesn't know David, his own brother. You know what is very interesting in all of this is to note that Eliab, in doing what he does, minimizes Goliath's arrogance and his blasphemies, and then falsely accuses his own brother of wickedness for doing and speaking what is right. Somebody's heart is in the wrong place, but it's not David's. It's Eliab's. You can see from this encounter why God did not choose Eliab to be the next king of Israel, because Eliab's heart is not where it needed to be. Oh, he was probably tall, dark, and handsome, but he was not the man God could use. He was not a man after God's own heart. So David confronts his brother, challenges him to be specific about the things he's charging him with, and goes on asking some others if what he's heard is true, and they confirm it. Well, word gets back because David has said, I'll fight him. Word gets back to King Saul. King Saul has him brought in. And David says something to King Saul. He says, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go up and fight this Philistine. King Saul tries to give David every opportunity for an out. Because in his eyes, this giant has been fighting probably from his youth, and you are just a youth. You are no match for this man in battle. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what Saul says to him. You're not able to go out against this Philistine, verse 33, and fight against him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. So David turns around and says to King Saul, but wait a minute. I've been taking care of my father's sheep, that's right. But when a lion came out and carried one of them off, or a bear came out and attacked one of them, I went after that lion and I went after that bear, and I killed them, and I recovered the sheep that had been taken by them. Folks, I've never fought with a lion and a bear, and I don't care to. Our news just this past week told of a young worker that was killed by a lion that happened to be out of its cage got into the cage where she was cleaning it. She lost her life. 2 weeks on the job. David killed a lion. David killed a bear. And in David's mind, if God has blessed me or allowed me to kill a lion and a bear, He will certainly permit me to kill this uncircumcised Philistine who, as David says, has taunted the armies of the living God. Verse 36, and he says, the Lord who delivered me from the lion and from the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. I want you to notice something. It's important for us here tonight. Faith is contagious. Folks, faith is contagious. When you have somebody like a David in your presence, and his faith in God is so strong, he says, I'll take this giant on. I'm not afraid of him because God is going to deliver him. That faith begins to wear off on other people. And it did that with Saul. Because Saul then gives him permission to go against this giant. He says, go, and may the Lord be with you. Saul couldn't say no to a young man who had that kind of faith and that determination. Wouldn't you like to have a few Davids around you in your life? Because when they have that kind of faith and they believe that strongly in something, it wears off on you and you want to jump right in with them and do whatever they're going to do. Now, Saul did try to help him out by giving him his own armor. But the problem was Saul was a much taller man than David. And it didn't fit David. David couldn't work in it. It wasn't suitable for what he needed to do. It's like the young player that's never played football and suddenly he puts on all of the equipment with helmet and everything and he finds he can't run near as fast as he could without it because it's constraining, it slows him down. He has to learn to adjust to it. And that would have been the same for David. So David opts to go with just what he's used to, what he has on at the present. His weapons, his staff, his sling, and a pouch to put his stones in. He goes down to the brook, he picks 5 small stones. And this is the part our children remember. Puts 5 stones into his pouch. And he starts toward the Philistine battle array. Goliath sees this young man, and I don't believe, because of the wording that is used, that David is a 12 or 13-year-old boy. I believe David's probably in his late teens, early 20s, maybe even a little older than that. But as he starts toward this giant looks at him, and all he sees is a boy with a stick in his hand coming at him, and he accuses him of somebody that would try to beat off a dog. And what the Philistine says to him is what we have recorded for us here. If you'll notice in verse 46, he is angry. He is angry that all of this has been said. Well, let me back up. And he sees him and he says, verse 43, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods, and he said, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." But listen to what David says. "You come to me with a sword and spear and javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Oh, what faith! What faith! And here's the thing. Verse 47. "That all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands." Folks, the battle is always the Lord's. In any contest we're engaged in, the battle is the Lord's, and we do good to well remember that. I'm not fighting alone, and David was not fighting alone that day. And it wasn't a contest between a giant and David. That wasn't what it was about. David was defending the armies of the living God. David was going out in the name of the God he served, because this man had blasphemed his God, and nobody blasphemes my God and lives to tell about it. At least not in David's mind. So the giant starts toward him. And David doesn't wait for him to get there. If you read the text, David starts running toward him. And as he's running, he takes out his sling, and he grabs a stone from his pouch, and he puts it in the sling. And as he's running, he takes that sling and starts swinging it around and around. And remember now, this giant is covered from head to toe with armor. He has a shield bearer in front of him. The only vulnerable spot on this man, on his entire body, is his forehead. On one occasion, the tribe of Benjamin had 700 men that were left-handed and could hit something within a hair's breadth with a stone. They were that accurate with those slings. I imagine David is no different, because the sling went round and round, and as the song that our young people learn, and the stone went up, 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 and what happened to the giant? It struck him in the forehead, and the Scriptures tell us he fell face down on the ground, dead. This is the place where I would like to have been a fly on the wall. Hollywood has missed its chance, because you can just see the Philistine army, and they're all frozen, looking, unable to do anything, because their champion has just fallen in front of them. He's never been beaten by anyone, or he wouldn't be there today. But he's fallen, he's dead, and he's not getting up. And suddenly this young man runs up, takes his sword, and cuts off his head. And time froze, folks. I believe it froze for just a moment. Not truly, but literally, but as you see it sometimes in the movies, where everything just seems to slow down, and there's the realization of what has just happened. Our champion is dead. We're defeated. And suddenly the Philistines turn and they run. And suddenly the Israelites realize that this man, this giant that they feared, is gone. He is no more. There is no more reason for them to stay on their side of the hill. They can now go after the Philistines, which they do, and they kill them as they go, all the way back to Gath and Ekron. Why? Because the battle was the Lord's. He's the one that gave them the victory that day. David was simply the instrument he used to accomplish what he needed to accomplish. Which brings me to where we are tonight. How contagious is your faith? When people around you, can they tell that there is a faith that is vibrant, that loves the Lord and wants to serve Him, and that there's nothing going to stop you or stand in your way from doing what God calls you to do? Because if your faith is contagious, there are others that will want to be with you. It attracts people. That type of faith just seems to draw other people to it. Maybe we need to pray that God will give us more contagious faith, that He will help us to have the type of faith that will draw others to His work. But not only that, if we remember that the battle is always the Lord's, whether we're trying to build a church or we're trying to tell the good news, it's always God's work that we're engaged in, and God will accomplish what He chooses to accomplish. God works upside down. He works backwards. His wisdom is not our wisdom. His ways are not our ways. He used the youngest, and I don't know if he was the smallest, but he was a whole lot smaller than his older brother, in using David to conquer a giant and then lead a nation. Will He use us to do His will here in this community? It's up to us. Do we have the faith to trust Him and to follow Him? You see, it's not the size of the person or the obstacle in front of us. It's the size of the God that we serve. And when God is working, then there is nothing that we can't do. So I ask you again, what kind of faith do you have? Will you trust God to lead you on to great things and eternally and eventually at the end of your life here upon this planet to lead you home? If you're a Christian, then maybe you have that kind of faith. But if you're not a Christian, if you've not given your life in obedient faith to Jesus Christ, had your sins washed away by being buried with Him in baptism, then why not tonight? Why not tonight? Do not let these words depart. Do not close your eyes against the light. Harden not your heart. Be saved, O tonight, as our song says. And if you need to come in obedient faith, won't you do so right now as together we stand and sing?